So tonight we are honored to welcome Tremaine Sanders. Ms. Sanders is an educator by day with nearly 15 years of experience and lots of degrees around education. She's also a writer, a poet, a singer, a TikTok creator with a huge following, and a lover of all things creative. We actually found Ms. Sanders through TikTok, and Katie can also put that link into the chat for you to click on if you want after the presentation, hopefully, so that you can check out Tremaine Sanders' TikTok feed, which is really seriously amazing and very, very content rich. Ms. Sanders is from Louisiana, and she is hailing from Houston, Texas tonight. This evening, she will speak about, well, the title is From Surviving to Thriving, and it's about racial inequities in the educational system in the United States, how deeply seated they are, and if there are any solutions available. So welcome, Tremaine Sanders. Please take it away, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much for that very, very warm welcome. And before I get started, I want to sincerely thank the Volusia Flagler chapter of the ACLU for having me. I am still amazed that people are interested in me and my TikToks. I certainly didn't think that would be the case when I started it. I started it as a way to cope with a devastating loss of a loved one last September, and it has blossomed. And so I am amazed. So thank you to everyone who is here tonight. And thank you to the ACLU for having me. So I am going to get started. I'm going to share my screen so we can get to the business at hand. So the title of tonight's talk is From Surviving to Thriving, Social Justice Through the Lens of Educational Equity. And I want to take a moment to talk about this title, because some of you might find the word surviving startling, right? But it's important to note that our schools are no longer functioning as houses of learning where students feel safe and where the entirety of their existence is being addressed. Their intellect, their spirit, their soul, that is no longer the case. Instead, our schools they've become war zones. And not just in the sense of the atrocities of school shootings, but every day teachers and students alike are going to school and trying to survive the very demoralizing environment that has elevated test scores above all else. The prioritization of tests over everything else makes it untenable in a lot of ways. And I also want to make it clear that I am not someone that is speaking from the outside looking in. I am in this work every day. I spend 8 hours today training educators so that they can go out and train people. So I am not speaking to you from the vantage point of research, even though you will see research throughout my presentation, because that is important. So you know that I am not just giving you my thoughts, but all of my assertions are backed up by the research. And so in this very test-obsessed environment, we have deprioritized the needs of our students. And so every day, our students and our educators are going into an environment that puts them into survival mode. And so what I am asserting tonight is that we need to move from survival to thriving. We need to return to a time or to create a space where people are not in survival mode when they enter a school, that they are actually able to thrive. And so we want to talk about social justice through the lens of educational equity, which is not always a part of or central to the conversation about social justice. And if you're here tonight, you care about social justice. And some part of you understands that we are living in an unjust society. So what I want to highlight for you is the ways in which the failings of our educational system are contributing to that unjust society. So you'll have to indulge the teacher in me. I have objectives. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll fully understand the depth and breadth of the educational inequities in this country and the ways in which it contributes to an unjust society for the marginalized. I hope you'll be able to acknowledge that the fight for educational equity is paramount to the quest for social justice. We cannot exclude education in the fight for social justice. And I want you to understand the difference between equality and equity, and understand that the urgency now is for equity. And so I want to start us off by discussing some historical views of the purpose and the function of education. And this is in chronological order. So first we have Horace Mann with a very, very popular idea as to what education should be and the way that it should function. He said that education then, above all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. Now, let me stop here to say that these three definitions, or these three ways that they have conceptualized, are aspirational, right? It's idealistic. Should education be the great equalizer? Absolutely. But inherent in the belief that education can be the great equalizer is the need for the education to be equal. And based on the history of this country, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, we know that it has never been equal. So I assert that education is not the great equalizer, but instead the great divider. So John Dewey, very famous educational philosopher, said that education serves to stimulate the intellectual, the social, and moral development of individuals, which ultimately contributes to the betterment of society. I absolutely love this philosophical, this very idealistic way to frame education. And it is honestly most closely aligned with my educational philosophy. I wish that there were a button that I could press to make this real, to bring this into actuality. But education in America, as it is presently constituted, it is not for the betterment of our society in the way that John Dewey would have intended it. And lastly, we have President John F. Kennedy, who said that, speaking of education, that it is both the foundation and the unifying force of our democratic way of life. It is at the same time the most profitable investment society can make and the richest reward it can offer. Again, I agree 100%, but this is aspirational at best. Now, it is important for me to stop here. You are going to notice throughout my talk that our schools mirror the society that we live in the worst possible ways. I want you to pin that in your minds cognitively, intellectually, and think of that throughout my talk, that our schools are mirroring our society. And you're here because you believe that we're in an unjust society and that you want to do the work of a more just society, getting us to a more just society. So think of that mirror that I am saying exists between education and our society as I go through this talk. So I want to ground our thinking today in this quote, and it is quite lengthy, but you will see that it is very valuable. I would recommend anybody who is interested in the work of education and the role that it plays in equity to read this book by the very brilliant Dr. Bettina Love. We want to do more than survive. Abolitionist teaching and the pursuit of educational freedom. This is one of the most life-affirming books that I've ever read, life-changing. So it is coming highly recommended from me. And so this is the quote that I want us to ground our thinking in. The educational survival complex has become so rationalized and normalized that we are forced to believe, against our common sense, that inadequate school funding is normal, that there is nothing that can be done about school shootings, that racist teachers in the classroom are better than no teachers in the classroom. We have come to believe that police officers in our schools physically assaulting students is standard practice, and that the only way to measure a child's knowledge is through pre-packaged high-stakes tests, the results of which undermine teachers' autonomy, deprofessionalize the teaching field, and leave dark children in the crosshairs of projected inferiority. After all the billions spent in test materials and meaningful teaching hours lost to test prep, dark children are held accountable for the failures of the public school system. And I'm just going to pause for a moment to give you an opportunity to let that sink in. This very dystopian reality that we are living in, where situations like Uvalde happen. We thought that nothing would ever happen like Columbine ever again, but now that has become the norm. This is dystopian at best, but we've settled into this idea that it is what it is. And to this piece about surviving in this test prep obsessed environment, please understand that test scores do not equate student achievement. Test scores only say that one has test taking skills. So we've shifted our focus away from what is best for children. And everything is focused, as Dr. Bettina Love says, on these pre-packaged high stakes state tests. What have we allowed to become normal? And who is profiting from the normalization of these atrocities? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves in the work of social justice. So let's talk about the current state of affairs. And this is where I am going to bring in the research that I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about some of the inequities in education. Black children are disproportionately likely to be suspended from preschool than their white peers. Can you imagine suspending a 4 or 5-year-old from school? It is because in this country, Black children are inherently seen as a threat. Black children don't get to be children. There's a lot of research out there about the adultification of children of color. Schools serving mostly students of color are more likely to be taught by out-of-field and novice teachers. Now, if you just take a cursory look at that, that seems sort of innocuous, but it isn't. Because these out-of-field novice teachers coming from programs like Teach for America, by and large, are coming in with what we call a savior complex. And despite, for the people who live in the South, despite our thinking that the majority of teachers are of color, the statistics say that 80% of the teaching force are white women. I want you to think about that, and the savior complex, and the understanding that our public schools are segregated all over again, and that they are Black and brown primarily. Students of color in schools located in disinvested communities are less likely to receive coursework targeted at grade appropriate standards, reflect high level cognitive demand, and are meaningfully engaging and relevant. This speaks to the inherent low expectations that have become commonplace in the realm of education. In the trainings that I facilitated yesterday, I stressed to the coaches that I was training that you get what you expect. And when teachers walk into a classroom who have not unpacked their internal biases, they walk into that classroom, whether they know it or not, with all the best intentions, and it is inherent in them. Low expectations for children of color. Black and Latinx students are provided less rigorous feedback about their work from classroom teachers than their white counterparts. Again, the low expectations. Why would I give you feedback when this is what I expected? If you gave me something that was not up to par, I needed to give you feedback because you have met my very low expectation. And as I explained to the teachers that I train, if the expectation is here and the kids come in here, we never do this. Instead, we do this. We bring them to the level of our expectation. But if you come in inherently believing that certain groups, certain demographics are not capable of excellence, then why would you give them feedback? Schools serving mostly students of color have lower quality or fewer resources than schools serving largely white populations, even within the same school district. I come from a district back home in Louisiana that gave the largest budget to the most high-performing schools. How counterintuitive is that? Wouldn't you give the largest budget to the schools that have the D and F ratings? But this is the inequity that I want you to think about. Again, our society, our schools are mirroring our society. Think about where our funding goes in this country. I tell people often that you can learn someone's priorities by examining their budget. Students of color are more likely to attend a school with an SRO, which is a school resource officer. And to go into even more detail, it's typically a police officer, some kind of law enforcement. They're going to schools with a school resource officer, but not a school counselor. That is more common for students of color than their white counterparts. Think about the over-policing of communities of color and make the correlation in your mind. Why do these schools filled with children of color have police officers but not school counselors? Schools are mirroring our society in the worst ways possible. But if you thought that social inequity stopped in the K-12 continuum, you are sorely mistaken. College and university students of color are less likely to have access to and participate in high impact activities such as the research opportunities with faculty, study abroad, internships, etc., than their white counterparts. And you would think that in a helping profession like education, that people have done the work of unpacking their internalized biases, but they haven't. And so people of color suffer. In undergrad, I went to an HBCU. And so I didn't feel this kind of thing until I went to graduate school at LSU, which is a PWI, or a predominantly white institution. And I constantly felt my Blackness in every way possible because I was in a white space, which is a great segue to this next data point. College, university students of color are more likely to endure stress and anxiety producing experiences brought on by routine microaggressions and cultural appropriation under the guise of free speech or for the edification of other students. They experience that stress and that anxiety more than their white peers. I cannot quantify the amount of times that I had to raise my hand in grad school for a moment of pause because something problematic had just been stated. Something offensive had just been stated. It happened countless times. And I went into that white space feeling my Blackness, feeling like I had to be the representation for Black people everywhere. Due to the dearth of professors of color at many universities, students of color say their point of view isn't represented when, for example, Western culture is considered the default standard by which all literature, architecture, film, and art is judged. Education is mirroring society. Now take a moment to think about everything that's going on in the zeitgeist right now. All of the arguments about what should be taught. The devaluing of the actual truth of American history. Most recently, it was up for debate in Texas as they're reworking their social studies curriculum. They wanted to replace the term slavery with involuntary relocation. Involuntary relocation. So imagine a Black student sitting in a history class, having to hear about slavery being talked about in such a reductive way by calling it involuntary relocation. Schools mirror our society. So you might want to say that our educational system is broken, but it is not. It is working exactly as it was intended to function. Our society has to have a hierarchy. It is at the heart of the very origins of our society that we must have people at the bottom of our society. We need to ask ourselves, why is America so committed to keeping its population uneducated? The public school system, our university, education in America is not broken. It is working as it was intended. And that is why I argue so much for the abolitionist school of thought, because some things can't be reformed. They have to be torn down and reimagined. So how did we get here? And this is my moment as a lover of history to give you just a few examples of this country's absolute commitment to keeping people of color uneducated in this country. And this commitment continues. But we must ask ourselves why and who is benefiting from people of color remaining uneducated. So let's talk history for a moment. So as it relates to the Native Americans, boarding schools for American Indian children emerged in this country in the late 1800s for the sole purpose of stripping them of their native culture and forcing them to assimilate into so-called white culture. Chinese Americans, even though Tate versus Hurley, which happened in 1884, established that Chinese American children had the right to go to public schools, California school boards continued to force Chinese American students to be educated in segregated Chinese schools for decades after that ruling. Now, mind you, these are just a handful of examples. I could have given you thousands. Hispanic Americans. It was not until 1931 that the first successful local school desegregation court decision made by a San Diego judge in Roberto Alvarez v. the Lemon Grove School Board prohibited the history of inequity in education in the Lemon Grove School Board from turning away Mexican American students. Not until 1931. So I'm sure you can see here that I have 4 examples for African Americans. So in the 1800s, that ushered in an increasing number of state laws that made it illegal for Black students to be taught to read and write in the South. These next 2 examples are important because I am hoping that if you are here and you are not a person of color, that you are working toward becoming an anti-racist, because we know it's not enough to not be racist. That's the bare minimum. You have to be working every day to be actively anti-racist. So a Quaker woman named Prudence Crandall opened a school for Black children in Connecticut. She was met with outrage and mobs, and she was forced to close the school. Similarly, Margaret Douglas in 1854 was sentenced to jail because she was caught attempting to teach children of freed Black Americans to read and write. We know that literacy was illegal within the confines of enslavement. But Margaret Douglas was teaching freed Black people to read, and she was still put in jail. Historians estimate that literacy rates among slaves in the antebellum South, that the literacy rate was as low as 5 to 10%. So I framed this history lesson with the question of how did we get here? How did we get to where we are today? Past is prologue. America has a tendency to take one step forward rather, toward equity, and then 3 steps back. I would encourage everyone to read the book White Rage. And I can't bring to mind her name right now, but White Rage outlines every historical moment in which there was a step forward for progress and then 3 steps back because of white rage and the lengths that white America has gone to keep people of color uneducated. Why is America so committed? We often hear that knowledge is power. It is cliche at this point. It is trite at this point. But I assert that ignorance is also power for the people who seek to exploit it. We are living at a time in this country where the ignorance of a few is being exploited to the detriment of all of us. Why is America historically committed and even now committed to keeping its population uneducated? So the fight for social justice. Gerardo Gonzalez said that the civil rights question of our nation today is that of access to quality education. He said that in 2001. The graphic I have here for you is showing you the gap between students in majority Black schools and students in majority white schools. The gap is even wider than it was before the pandemic. The so-called achievement gap that I'm sure you've all heard about. There can be no discussion of social justice without a discussion of education and equity. And I say equity because it is too late for equality. Horace Mann, who believed that education was the great equalizer, if he was right, if everybody began on equal footing, his assertion would have been absolutely correct. But we're past the point of equality because some communities have been left so far behind that if you start equal tomorrow, they still will never catch up. So the true fight is for equity. And take a moment to look at this graphic, because equality says that we all get equal. We all get the same measure. But notice how they all, in the equality side of this graphic, they all have the same. But this poor soul in the purple can't see over the privacy fence. The person in the red is barely able to view the baseball game because they all got equal. But equity says that we give each person the measure that they need to level the playing field. So that poor baby in the purple needed 2 crates. This is what the fight has to be for. It has to be for equity. Communities that have been neglected. We hear terms like disenfranchised, marginalized. Let's just call them what they are. They are ignored communities. They are the communities that no one has cared about, that our society has benefited from keeping them at the bottom. You can't give those communities 1 crate and expect them to somehow level up. This notion of pulling oneself up by bootstraps is nonsensical at best. Because first I'd have to have boots. And we know that Native communities, Black communities, immigrant communities don't have boots. So how, pray tell, will they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? It is too late for equality. It is time for equity. And if you are in the fight for social justice, your fight is not for equality. Your fight has to be for equity. And lastly, I just want to posit this, that it's time to reimagine our society. We are living inside of the imagination of white, slave-owning, colonial men. That's who wrote our founding documents. It's time to reimagine our society. Because again, the criminal justice system is not broken. Public education is not broken. They are all functioning as they were intended. And this is why I align myself with the abolitionist school of thought. Some things can't be fixed because they aren't broken. It is now time to reimagine our society in ways that don't require a hierarchy. Toni Morrison talked about the fact that racism was an issue that white people needed to address, because what does it say about you that you only feel tall when other folks are on their knees? Can we not live in a society where nobody is on their knees? But the society that we live in as currently constructed requires that certain communities be on their knees so that white supremacy continues to reign. But we have the ingenuity and the intellectual capability to reimagine our society. The question is, do we have the intestinal fortitude to do what is necessary to create a better world for the generations to come? And that is it for me. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Well, Tremaine, that was very, very excellent. Thank you so very much, and extremely compelling. Whenever I think I have a clue, then a speaker like you comes along and shows me that I have so much more to learn. how our society and this country is based and rooted in racism is a constant reason for what we do and to rail against it, but how this racism is then more so even rooted in education and starts really forming the youngest and the most vulnerable of our societal members is just outrageous. And you're right, we do have to reimagine a new society. And I'd like to take this moment to also point out that here in Florida, we're having elections on August 23rd. And so please go out and vote for school board members that support racial equity, that support the full teaching of history in schools, that support the education and uplifting of marginalized students, LGBTQ, transgender, Black, Brown, et cetera, those that we have the ability to vote for people that are going to make a difference in our schools. So yeah, definitely wanted to mention that in case you're not already on fire about voting. Your presentation has put even more fire under it, I think. Here in Florida, as you may know, is critical race theory is basically banned, from schools. Well, it's actually it's a college course, but the whole idea of teaching complete history in schools is just not even an option, because white children might feel uncomfortable, or they might feel, called out, or whatever the reasoning is, if the history of slavery is taught, or the history of any kind of Black suppression. It's not just slavery; it's everything since then as well. So, how can we possibly, change the curriculum, which is where it should start, for one thing?
Yeah, I believe firmly that educators have to be revolutionaries at this moment in history. If I was still in the classroom teaching, I can tell you with certainty that I would ignore any such legislation that tried to shackle me based on some political agenda. And thank you for saying that critical race theory. And I have several books on this bookshelf behind me, but I didn't get those books until graduate school. So it has just become a buzzword. And that's why I mentioned that ignorance is power. Also, because people are their ignorance and their lack of knowledge is being exploited. And so they're being fed a completely propaganda-fueled agenda that is not based in any real sense of reality. And
Right.
for students, the idea, I found it fascinating, this idea of white children being uncomfortable, because my retort to that is, what about Black children who are going to school and rarely seeing themselves represented? How do little Black and brown children feel in schools? Is anyone concerned about the affective domain and their social well-being, with all of this focus on how white children feel?
Absolutely. You all are posing questions in the chat, which is great. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that again. And so thank you for that. And I'm going to address some of these. One of them is that we're having, especially here in Florida, and I'm sure you're dealing with similar things in Texas, because, Texas we're experiencing a lot of book bannings here in Florida, in particular, in the United States in general. There are groups of activism groups like Moms for Liberty, that will go through all kinds of books and declare them as challenged, and then some of those become banned in schools. And these are often, classics, and they are often books that deal with racial inequity and among other things. So how do you, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of what we can do?
Yes, absolutely. So I want us to make sure that we understand the historical parallel. We need to remember the Daughters of the Confederacy. This was a group of women who single-handedly are responsible and can be credited with the reframing of the Civil War. Mm. They fought against any curriculum that would say that the Civil War was based on slavery, that it was rooted in oppression and racism. And so a part of their work was to ban anything that taught the actual truth. And so they reshaped the narrative. And it's why you have people today that insist that the Confederate flag is not a symbol of racism, but of Southern heritage. Mm. And so what I want people to be aware of is that also in Germany, it began with banning books. And so I need us to understand that we are living through the first stages of a complete fascist society. It begins with the banning of books. And so again, teachers, administrators, superintendents have to become revolutionaries. If the people in the field of education do not take a stand, if the parents of school-age children do not take a stand, then we're headed to a very, very dark place. The Daughters of the Confederacy, they rewrote history in a sense by banning the teaching of the actual events. And that's what we're living through right now. So the revolution is upon us.
That's very true. And can you put that into a time context when the Daughters of the Confederacy started becoming, active like that? Was that in
and I don't want to get this wrong, to my understanding, without having the ability to look it up right now, this was our Reconstruction. This was the pushback, because at that point, you had Black people who were getting into political office. Black people were gaining more social currency. And so there was a push. I have to remind people that the Confederate monuments were not erected during the Civil War. All of that came about much, much later as acts of terrorism.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question here that says, if you were to take a political office, like, Secretary of Education, for example, which would be awesome, what kind of changes would you specifically make?
Well, number one, for me, the priority agenda item for me would be to give teachers complete autonomy. I would insist that we shift from this obsession with high stakes testing, that we can thank the 2003 legislation, No Child Left Behind, because American education has been on the decline since then. So if I were to take up political office, like Secretary of Education, first order of business is to do away with high stakes testing. Because as Dr. Bettina Love said, it has ruined the profession. It has watered down the education, and kids and teachers alike are in survival mode because of it. And I certainly would not entertain any agenda that handcuffs or bans books, or because true education is about intellectual freedom. It is about pushing our kids to think critically, and they can't think critically without all of the information. And we're doing them a disservice by giving them pieces. It's often said that American education is a mile wide, but only an inch deep. And that's intentional.
Yes. Just as an aside, and maybe hopefully of interest to our audience as well. I'm an American, born in the United States, but I grew up in Germany, and all my education was in Germany, kindergarten through university. And when I started coming back to the United States, I was really deeply shocked at the lack of education that professional people had, that the lack of education, or the degree, the little bit of education that was expected of people, the lack of literacy, the lack of just a broad education in general. And I have since found that is just that is standard, for the United States, is and it's on purpose, like you said. There's a purpose behind it, which is to keep people dumb and poor, and therefore they have no power, because they're constantly surviving.
Exactly.
There's someone here asking, who's a white teacher. She says, my second grade students are primarily children of color. What is the one most important piece of advice you can give to make my classroom a safe and loving space for them?
Oh, I love that question. See them as human beings. See them as people. Reject anything that comes from your administration that is cloaked in data-driven instruction. Do what is best for them, for their lives. Because what we've done in education is we've gotten so far away from what happens to them as human beings. Teach them as though you want to pour into them with concern for who they become as human beings. That's the best that we can give to our kids. We need to care about them beyond how they make us look at the end of the year on our evaluation, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We only have a couple more minutes.
Okay.
There's a question: do you have any recommendations for resources for parents to encourage abolitionist thought to their kids? I think there's lots of
yes.
literature out there.
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. The New Jim Crow is a book that everyone should read. Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me is also something that I recommend. Like I said earlier, White Rage. I would also recommend Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. That's top 5. If you want to deconstruct whiteness, if you want to begin the work of anti-racism, that's a great place to start.
All right. People have been asking about the recording. In general, we will send out the recording, and with permission of the speaker, possibly also the presentation, if you want to make that available.
Sure.
To everyone who registered, including obviously those who came tonight. And so I can't thank you enough, for your amazing insight, your wonderful presentation. I can only recommend to everyone to check out Tremaine on her TikTok. It's deeply content rich and absolutely worthwhile. And it's only a couple minutes, per couple of days, right? So, Katie, if you don't mind putting that, yes, there you go. There, the link is in the chat. And so Tremaine, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation tonight. If you all would like to unmute yourself and give your thanks and say hello or goodbye, please do that.
Hey, Tremaine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys are so welcome.
Thank you, Tremaine.
Thank you, Tremaine. Thank you.
This
was incredible. Thank you.
This is phenomenal,
Tremaine, are you on Twitter?
Thank you,
Thank
Tremaine.
you very, very much. And thank you all for being open-minded, attending. Thank you.
What just happened?
Thank you.
Yes. You're
Thank you very
welcome.
much.
I am not active on Twitter, but I'm working on it at the behest of my TikTok supporters.
I think you
I'm
would have a
working on
natural
all of it.
audience there, and there's something called Twitter Spaces. And there's such a thriving intersectional thing happening right now, as well as a lot of Black justice spaces and spaces to try to get everybody to be good allies ahead of this election. And there's this thing
Yes.
called Democracy First ED, which is absolutely warm and welcoming, and you would be so welcome to come by and talk to us for a few minutes. Democracy First ED. on
Democracy
Twitter
First
Spaces.
ED. Okay, I'm gonna write that down. Yes, I am working on it. I'm getting myself out there in all of the social media places. You guys are so welcome. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being interested in my stream of consciousness.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming. Don't forget August 16th, Racism and Language. And we will see you then. Take care.
Okay.
So well done, Tremaine. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.